I think it is a good thing. I mean, there were periods, like at the breakup of the Beatles where we weren't so friendly, so you couldn't do anything like this then because the sort of hurt feelings and stuff like that would have crept in.
What if I told you that behind Paul McCartney's iconic smile hides a grudge so powerful it shaped his story? Who was the one person he despised more than anyone else? Stay with me until the end, because the revelation of Paul's greatest enemy is shocking, and it just might change the way you see him forever. The best friend who became the loudest enemy. It wasn't just that Paul McCartney and John Lennon were in the same band. Their dream was to use music to change the world. They were two boys from Liverpool. They wrote songs together that made a generation famous and put the Beatles at the top of the music world. Even though they were brothers, they were closer than most, which made their fights worse. The impact from the end of their friendship was explosive and personal. They broke up over more than just the end of the Beatles. It had to do with pride, power, and being hurt. John thought Paul wanted to lead the band after Brian Epstein died, but Paul thought John had given up on keeping them together. That anger built up for years until it became clear to everyone. By the time the band broke up, their friendship was tainted by anger. It had turned from artistic magic to open war. Fans had never heard an attack like "How Do You Sleep?" before John put it out in 1971. While making fun of Paul's music, lyrics, and even attitude, the song said he was shallow and silly. It wasn't a secret message, it was a blow to the face meant to make him look bad in public. In his own way, Paul reacted by making sharp jabs in his solo albums, though they were never as direct as John's. When people used to work together, music turned into a tool in a war. They were very angry with each other during the song Wars. It turned into a race from working together, and each lyric hurt like a knife. Their fight made the news, and it was clear that the Beatles were no longer together. Fans took sides. Some said Paul was to blame for the split, while others said John was to blame. They weren't writing songs with each other. Instead, they were writing songs against each other. The courtroom war was terrible, even more so than the song fights, which were very personal. In 1970, Paul went to court to end the Beatles' business relationship. Even though he did it to get away from Alan Klein's control, John saw it as a breach of their brotherly bond. John thought that Paul had brought personal issues into the public court system. When they did this, the anger got even worse. The case put an end to the Beatles as a group for good. People saw Paul as the bad guy because he broke up the band. But his real goal was to protect their future earnings. In interviews, John slammed Paul's new music and called it background noise. That made things worse between them. The fight wasn't just about the law, it was also about feelings, and the wounds didn't heal quickly. Even though he was angry, Paul never let himself really hate John. He didn't hate the man, but he did hate being lied to, being pushed aside, and being betrayed. In later years, Paul said that there was still love underneath all the anger. He said that Lennon was like a brother, and that tie could not be broken. Even after all the fights, even though the pain never went away, hate never took over. There were signs of peace between them in the years after their fight. Paul and John started talking to each other again in the late 1970s. Even though their talks weren't perfect, they gave the impression that they were getting better before Lennon was killed in 1980. Their story was already sad, but this unfinished piece made it even worse. Paul felt both sad and relieved. He was relieved that at least the way to friendship was back open. Hatred was very strong, but it didn't last forever. Few people talk about this insight. Even though Lennon's attacks were mean, they made Paul improve his songs. Albums like Band on the Run might not have had as much drive and purpose without that competition. What looked like anger was really just fuel. Lennon may have used words to try to bury Paul, but he gave Paul the drive to become a music star on his own. This competition was painful, but it helped Paul stay alive. Yoko Ono wasn't just John's partner. She was the fault line that cracked the Beatles, and Paul never saw it coming. The woman who divided the Beatles. Even though Yoko Ono didn't yell or storm into meetings, the Beatles' world felt like it was shaking when she was there. In the studio, while they were recording, she did something that no partner had ever done before. For Paul, this broke the unspoken rule that work and personal life should stay separate. John's attention was now on her, and rehearsals that used to go quickly and smoothly stopped. The balance of the band was thrown off, and Paul didn't know what to do to stop it. Paul didn't just find Yoko's steady presence strange, it was annoying. The Beatles had always made music with a small group of close friends and family. Now, that group felt like it had been broken into. He saw that his friends were getting angry, fighting more, and losing their cool. As the group sang, tensions in the room kept drawing their attention away from the music. It used to be easy to work together, but now there was awkward quiet, and tempers were short. The real trouble wasn't just that Yoko was there, it was what she stood for. Paul could see that John was no longer faithful at all. John always chose what was best for Yoko, even when it went against what the group thought should be done. Paul used to depend on Lennon as a partner, but now he felt like he had to fight for his attention. That sudden space hurt just as much as the interruption. For Paul, it seemed like the band's base had broken. Rather than having separate goals, he thought that the Beatles worked because they worked together. With Yoko on John's side, it looked like they could never get back together. Paul didn't like how quickly things had changed and how little he could do about it. He thought that the dream they had worked so hard to build was running away, and there was no way to stop it. Yoko Ono was said to be Paul's worst enemy over and over again by his fans. The story is simple, but it's not the whole truth. Paul later said that he respected her part in John's life, even though he didn't like her influence when the Beatles broke up. He even said she helped John be himself. That doesn't sound like pure hate. It sounds more like accepting something without wanting to. Paul and Yoko finally got along again, especially after John died. He saw that John's happiness was more important than holding a grudge. By the 1980s, Paul was openly defending her, going against the idea that she was the one who broke up the Beatles. He was still angry about those heated meetings, but it got better over time. After all that, they agreed that Yoko had been a part of John's life, whether Paul liked it or not. There's a new angle that's often missed. Because Yoko was there, Paul had to show himself outside of the Beatles. Paul might have been stuck on a sinking ship for longer during the breakup without her. But because of her, Paul jumped right into his solo business, making McCartney and then Band on the Run. Fans saw what they saw as damage, but it also made him more independent, which was the key to his long-term success. In this way, the villain indirectly helped Paul become one of the most famous musicians who lived through the hard times. The man who stole the Beatles. Alan Klein got into the lives of the Beatles when they were at their weakest. The band had just lost Brian Epstein, who was their valued manager and took care of their business. Klein stepped into that space. He was smooth, sure of himself, and good at making people believe he could solve their problems. John, George, and Ringo were quickly won over by his good looks and promises of more money. Paul, on the other hand, saw trouble in him right away. Paul had always been wary of business deals because he knew from a young age that bad contracts could mean losing his music. Paul's instincts were at odds with Klein's aggressive attitude. Others said Klein was tough, but Paul saw control and trickery. He was afraid Klein cared more about getting his cut than keeping the Beatles' reputation alive. This early lack of trust led to one of the worst fights in the history of music. Klein moved quickly to take charge of the Beatles' business once he got inside. He changed the terms of contracts, reorganized Apple Corps, and made himself look like the group's financial salvation. John, George, and Ringo put their trust in him to handle everything, but Paul wouldn't sign. Because he refused, Paul was the only Beatle who was not giving in to Klein's control. It wasn't just about numbers. It was about who really had the power to decide what would happen with the Beatles. There was a cold war in the band because of this standoff. Klein had the support of 3 Beatles, but Paul was by himself. As people's loyalties were split, rehearsals got tense, conversations turned nasty, and bonds were put under a lot of stress. Finally, Paul did something brave. He sued his friends to get away from Klein's rule. The lawsuit put a stop to the Beatles for good, and Paul became known as the person who broke up the band. Paul was mad at Klein for more reasons than just money. For him, Klein was a sign of betrayal from within because his friends picked Klein over working with Paul. It wasn't just about money. He had lost faith in people he used to call brothers. Klein whispered vows to John, George, and Ringo, which made it impossible for Paul's warnings to be heard. Paul was very angry because he felt like he was being squished. Klein was also known for being shady outside of the Beatles, and Paul saw that history was repeating itself. He thought they were giving away the kingdom they worked so hard to someone who didn't care about their art. The others were fooled by Klein's charm, but Paul wouldn't give in, even if it made him look bad. Paul was both the bad guy and the good guy in the story, because he was so stubborn. He went further in the fight than anyone thought he would because he was angry. Paul was right all along, as time showed after many years. Klein's shady actions were shown in court, showing that he made deals with people that were not honest and handled money in a bad way. Finally, Paul's warnings came true, but the win was not what it seemed like. It cost a lot. For years, he lost his ties with John, George, and Ringo. In the news, he was seen as the person who broke up the Beatles. It wasn't an enemy, but a friend, Michael Jackson, who betrayed Paul in the most devastating way imaginable. From duet to betrayal. In the 1980s, Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson looked unstoppable together. They worked on hits like Say, Say, Say and The Girl Is Mine, mixing Paul's classic songwriting with Michael's new wave stardom. Behind the music, Paul saw Michael as more than a collaborator. He saw him as a younger brother in the industry. During their talks, Paul gave Michael one piece of golden advice. Music publishing was where the true money lived. For Paul, it was friendly guidance. For Michael, it was a lesson that would change history. In 1985, Michael stunned the world by buying ATV Music for $47.5 million. Overnight, he gained control of 4,000 songs, including nearly the entire Beatles catalog. Paul's heart sank because those songs weren't just property. They were pieces of his life and work. Worse, it wasn't a stranger who had swooped in. It was the very man Paul had welcomed as a partner and friend. Michael had taken Paul's own advice and used it in a way Paul never expected. Business deals can sting, but for Paul, this was more than numbers on a contract. He had shared trust, collaboration, and respect with Michael. To lose control of his life's greatest work to an industry rival would have been painful enough, but to lose it to someone he once laughed and sang with felt personal. Michael became more than a shrewd businessman. In Paul's eyes, he became a betrayer. It wasn't about money, it was about friendship turned into rivalry. After the catalog purchase, the friendship collapsed in silence. They stopped recording, stopped talking, and drifted apart as though the collaboration had never happened. Publicly, Paul kept his words polite, careful never to launch open attacks on Michael. Privately, however, the wound never healed, because it was wrapped in both business and emotion. A friendship that had once looked so full of promise now stood as one of the most bitter endings in Paul's life. Fans often argue over who Paul disliked most, John Lennon, Alan Klein, or even Yoko Ono. But insiders point to Michael Jackson as the person who cut deepest. John and Paul had creative clashes, but that was family tension. Klein was an outsider, and Paul always expected trickery from businessmen. But Michael had been a friend, and betrayal from a friend leaves scars that no court or contract can erase. Few people realize how long this catalog war followed Paul. For decades, he fought to regain control of his own music, navigating legal challenges and industry loopholes. Every year, the songs stayed locked under someone else's name. The betrayal replayed itself. Only in the 2010s did Paul begin winning back rights to Beatles songs, finally clawing back ownership after more than 30 years. The battle showed how one friendship-turned-business deal could cast a shadow across half of Paul's life. The catalog wasn't just money and pride. It shaped Paul's sense of security as an artist. For years, he had to pay royalties just to perform the very songs he wrote. Imagine standing on stage singing "Hey Jude," knowing the profits flowed to someone else. That weight shaped his finances, his mindset, and even his decisions about touring and recording. More than anything, it reminded him that betrayal doesn't end with silence. It lingers in every contract, every stage light, every note sung. His enemies are gone, yet Paul's deepest wound remains, a reminder that even legends are human, scarred by betrayal and loss. The man who outlived his enemies. Paul McCartney watched the people who once clashed with him disappear one by one. John Lennon was taken too soon, leaving behind unfinished music and an unfinished friendship. Alan Klein fell from power, exposed as the shady figure Paul had warned everyone about. Michael Jackson, who once stood beside him on stage, died before his time, leaving behind the Beatles' catalog that had driven a wedge between them. Paul remained, carrying the weight of those rivalries long after the others were gone. Fans often argue about who drew Paul's deepest anger, John, Yoko, or Klein. But the truth points to Michael Jackson, because betrayal from a friend always stings the most. Paul could forgive family quarrels with John, or even grudgingly accept Yoko's presence. Klein was a businessman, and Paul knew what to expect from businessmen. But Michael had been trusted, welcomed, and embraced, only to turn that closeness into the most personal wound Paul ever carried. Few realize how long the catalog loss hung over Paul's career. For decades, he paid royalties just to perform songs he had written in his youth. Every concert was a reminder that control of his own art had been stolen. Even with his fortune, the financial imbalance cut deep, because art to Paul wasn't just business, it was his identity. This wasn't about numbers on a ledger, it was about being locked out of his own legacy. The irony is that Paul's anger may have been what kept him sharp. Where others faded, he kept creating, driven by the need to prove himself again and again. The betrayals carved scars, but they also gave him a reason to keep pushing into new decades of music. Instead of letting bitterness end him, he reshaped it into longevity. Hatred for Paul became less a poison and more a strange kind of survival instinct. When Paul smiles on stage, audiences see the legend, not the scars. Yet beneath the spotlight lives a man who never stopped guarding his work, never stopped fighting for control of his songs. His enemies hurt him, and those wounds changed him just as much as his biggest hits. They gave him the fire to keep going, even after they were gone. Paul McCartney left behind more than just love songs. He also left behind a reminder that even legends are driven by pain as well as hope. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Click on the next video popping up on your screen for more amazing content.